Hey guys, it's Toxic Titan Gaming, and for this video, we're going to go into the next phase of the how to Magic the Gathering, I guess is what you could say. This one is going to talk a little bit more about like how the actual process of a turn goes, because that's kind of an important part of learning to play Magic. I think after this, there are lots of other parts. And what I may do is I may do one more video as an instructional like how to Magic video where I go over some of like the basic terms that show up a whole bunch on cards and have stayed consistent throughout Magic. But other than this video and the next one, I think after that it'll just be either gameplay or there are a couple other ideas I've had about like stuff that's to do with Magic the Gathering but not gameplay. So as of right now, what we're going to do is we're going to get into how a turn is structured, and there are guides online. I've got one pulled up, that way I can make sure I have all the steps right, but I'll try to have some graphics going around to kind of have it in order for you, and it's broken up fairly simply, but there are some complicated things that can happen all throughout things, and there are some phases that have like little sub phases, and so it's a little bit, it's not difficult, but it can be more complex than just this happens, it's your turn. So at the very beginning, and on your first turn this won't matter as much, but there is an untap phase, which in Magic the Gathering, how you cast things is by tapping lands, which means you turn it from vertical to horizontal. Or there are a lot of times, like in Paper Magic, I'll just turn it some. But so you turn it some so that you know that you can't use that mana anymore for that turn. At the beginning of your turn, you untap all your lands, which means that you open up all your mana again. That way you don't have to worry about having to have like thousands of mana just to play all your cards. It would be kind of dumb if you just cast something and then you couldn't use the mana ever again. So untap is kind of a way to reuse your lands and get more mana every turn. And then you have upkeep. And upkeep is not as important in a lot of like, you don't always see upkeep used. There are some card effects that will say during your upkeep or during your opponent's upkeep, something happens. It's a lot of executing card effects. You can also, throughout any phase of the game, you can cast instants, and so, especially if you play on Magic the Gathering Arena, it will stop you at upkeep to say, hey, sometimes it'll stop you at upkeep to say, hey, you got something that you can cast at instant speed, which means that you can cast it as if it's an instant spell, like the same times that you would cast an instant spell. So if they say, they'll say like, it'll like stop you on the screen for a second, and it'll like have a little border around whatever you can cast. And so, especially in Paper Magic, you got to remember all those upkeep things. That's why I kind of recommend Magic the Gathering Arena if you haven't played at all. It's a really, really good way it's a really good tutor as to how to play. And then you have draw, which is just you draw a card. And again, during this phase, you could also activate instants. That's going to be a given throughout any of these phases. And then you're on to your first main phase. And your main phase is where you do a lot of your stuff. In your main phase, you play sorceries. You play your creatures. You play enchantments. You play some instants if you want to. You can play your artifacts, which are these typically colorless items that will enhance various factors of the game. There's a numerous set of artifacts. There's some synergy that goes in with it being itself and that kind of thing. And so main phase is where you do a lot of your just casting straight out. And then you go down to combat phase. And combat phase gets a little bit more complicated. It's not super complicated, but it's more complex than like the main phase where it's just play things. For your combat phase, there are 5 to 6 phases, depending on how things go. First, you enter combat, which there are triggers at each level, and so if you get triggered on like somebody casts an instant at a certain level, you'd have to resolve, which means just let the cards play as they do, or like counter or whatever else to the cards that were played before you can move on to the next sub-phase of whichever phase you're on. Then there's declare attackers. Declaring attackers is basically you say, okay, I want these creatures to attack my opponent. You can't choose to like attack specific creatures. Like if you played Yu-Gi-Oh, you know that you say I attack this monster with this monster. It's not like that. You kind of have to decide, okay, I want to attack with this because maybe it'll survive against whatever my opponent has, even if they block, which is the next phase. Declaring blockers is your opponent's side of the attack of the combat phase. Declaring blockers is that they choose, okay, I have these creatures on my field and I want to send some so that I don't take damage. And declaring blockers, unless a creature has specific card text that says it deals damage after it's been blocked, the damage is canceled. So you could even take a 1/1 that you have on your field and block a 12/12 on their side of the field, and it would just do no damage. Your 1/1 would be gone, but that 12/12 didn't do 11 damage to your face. Didn't do 12 damage to your face either. So that's a really good thing about that. Once all the blockers have been declared and any sorts of card effects have been taken care of, there are certain types of abilities that let you attack, that let you do damage earlier than other creatures do. And that's how you can sort of get around the whole blockers and things. Some creatures have what's called first strike, and first strike is that it lets you deal your damage before anything else does, or at least anything else that doesn't have first strike. Or double strike. Double strike means that you deal damage at both phases, where you deal damage at the regular one and then you deal first strike damage too. So if two things have first strike damage, they'll both hit each other at the same time. But if something has regular and something has first or double strike, then the first or double strike will hit first. And then it goes to regular combat damage, which is fairly normal. Everything goes out and does its things that you've commanded it to do. And then it's the end of combat, which, again, mostly what happens there is just triggers go off if you have instance or something that says, at the end of combat, this happens. And a lot of cards will have, like, this happens until end of combat, or at end of combat, this happens. So it's just one of those things to know which cards you have and to know, like, when to look for certain triggers. Then you have the second main phase, and it's exactly like the first main phase, except it's after combat, which means sometimes you don't want to play a card before you go into combat because maybe you have an instant in your hand that if they do something, you'll be able to play it, but otherwise you'll want to use that mana to build your field. Also, I forgot to mention it in the first main phase, you can play lands. You can only play one land a turn, but you can play your lands in either of your main phases. You can only play it, like I say, one a turn. So if you played a land in your first main phase, you cannot play it in your second. There are cards that let you get around that because there's pretty much a card that'll say, well, you can do this instead of this for a lot of cases. There are some that I'm sure that they won't ever mess up, but it's one of those things where sometimes you just want to get your stuff out and then attack. Like there are certain cards that can attack the first turn that they come out. Most creatures suffer what's called summoning sickness. And summoning sickness, it means that the turn that they are played, they cannot tap and therefore cannot attack, and they cannot activate abilities that require them to be tapped. And then after the second main phase, there is the end phase. And the end phase has two parts. Fairly simple. There is end turn, which is just you're saying, hey, I'm done with my turn, and that's a trigger in and of itself. And then there's the cleanup phase that comes right after you end your turn. The cleanup phase is kind of where all sorts of things happen. If you have more than 7 cards in your hand, then you discard down to 7. If any of your creatures have taken damage in that turn, all the damage is removed and they go back to, for instance, if that 12/12 was blocked by a 1/1 back in the combat phase, that 12/12 goes back to a 12/12 rather than a 12/11. Because technically, if damage is done in a turn, it piles on itself. So if you had like a 3/3 that was blocked by a 1/1, and then you used like an instant or a sorcery that dealt 2 damage to it, it would die. So at the cleanup phase, all that damage is nullified and it goes back to whatever it is regularly. And then you also remove effects that are end of turn effects. So like there are a lot of green buff cards that will be until end of turn you get like +3/+3. So that ends at the cleanup phase, which is right at the end of your turn. And it says that during cleanup, according to this guide that I'm using, no instants or activated abilities of cards can be activated in cleanup, which means you have to activate it at like when the person says it's the end of my turn, and then you can say at your end step or at the end of your turn, and then go into all that stuff before all the damage and stuff is removed. But that's really it. It's not a super complicated process. And then after the cleanup, obviously, it goes to the next player's untap, and then the whole process repeats. But it's a fairly simple structure. Once you know kind of at least a little bit how it works, then it could be real easy to get into. And I hope it is, because this game is wonderful and I've loved playing it, especially recently. And so I hope that all of you enjoy it too. I really want to... I would love if out of all of this, I at least get like 1 or 2 more people to think, man, Magic could be really fun. And then you start playing. Even if you just put it back down because you're just like, I tried it, it's not for me. That's fine. Just so long as you give it a shot, because I know I said it in the first video, but the card art is wonderful. Even if you don't like the card, even if you don't like the game, you can look at the card art and appreciate that. There are all sorts of ways that you can like Magic the Gathering, even if you don't play it. So just getting people immersed into like, hey, this is the kind of thing that happens. And even to the point that if you get into this and you're like, I really love like some of the cards and things, but I don't like playing the game, but you like playing, like, for instance, Dungeons and Dragons. There are like settings that have been developed because both Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering are Wizards of the Coast products. There are settings that have been developed by Wizards of the Coast for Dungeons and Dragons set in the Magic the Gathering universe. Because there is some lore. I'm not super hot on what the lore is. I mostly just play the game and like making big creatures. So I'll let you figure that out if that's what you want to do. There are all sorts of things that anyone can really do. So, as for this video, I suppose it's done. So, until next time, have fun, play games, and take care. Bye.